expect somebody will jump in.
Somebody will blurt it out.
Good afternoon, everyone. My pleasure to kick things off this afternoon. I'm Bill Bruins, President of Wisconsin Farm Bureau, and it's my privilege and honor to announce that Wisconsin Farm Bureau, by the way of their Political Action Committee, has decided to endorse Scott Walker for governor, for the next governor of the state of Wisconsin. Yeah, we can clap on that. Scott Walker grew up in a small town in southern Wisconsin. In his formative years, he was immersed in rural Wisconsin, so he understands the ag community. Scott Walker understands that agriculture is a major economic engine for the state of Wisconsin, contributing over $59 billion of economic activity and providing 1 out of every 10 jobs. He understands that the family farm businesses thrive when taxes are held in check. Scott Walker will hold the line on property taxes by protecting use value assessment of ag land. Scott Walker will push for regulatory reform to promote the growth of our family farm businesses. He will work to strengthen infrastructure in rural communities to move product from farm to processor to market, whether that be a local market, domestic market, or international market. Scott will work with the University of Wisconsin to make sure the next generation of farmers has the tools and the training it needs to allow agriculture to thrive in the 21st century. Scott Walker's #1 job as governor will be to put the state's fiscal house in order. He will do this not by raiding funds, but by cutting spending and shrinking the size of government. I believe that Scott Walker is a statesman who will work with all stakeholders to pave the way for a better tomorrow for rural Wisconsin. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Walker.
Well, thanks. Boy, after an introduction like that, I should say thank you all for being here. It's time to go, right? He had everything out there, and I appreciate that. For me, sometimes people wonder, saying, guys from Milwaukee County, what do you know about agriculture? But as Bill mentioned, growing up in Delavan, down in Walworth County. In fact, I was just down at the Walworth County Fair yesterday, one of the great traditions of Labor Day. Saw your Farm Bureau president down there. He came over by the booth and was with me for a while. And even before that, I lived a few years. A lot of people don't recognize that. But growing up in Delavan, right before that, 1977, when I was real young, before that, I lived a couple years just over the Mississippi in Plainfield, Iowa. Population of 450 people, which you can imagine was quite a rural area. And of all people, a little trivia, my state assemblyman back then was none other than Chuck Grassley, who's now the United States Senator from Iowa, but lived there for a few years before moving to the big city of Delavan, 8,000 folks, and certainly learned a lot. My dad was a preacher, but a lot of folks in our church were involved in farming, either in agribusiness or right on the farm themselves, whether it was crop farming, milking, and otherwise. And so we learned that early on. In fact, one of the deacons in our church ran a dairy farm, and his wife was my third grade teacher. So I learned a lot about that early on, and it's only appropriate now. I'm really honored to have the support of the volunteer component of the Wisconsin Farm Bureau, the Volunteers for Agriculture, and our support for our campaign for governor here in Wisconsin. I also want to begin, though, by thanking the Bradleys for having me here. Appreciate not only you hosting, but your leadership as well as part of the board of directors of the Wisconsin Farm Bureau. And it's been a Farm Bureau weekend for me. I was over with another one of your colleagues over in Mineral Point over on Saturday, making our way around. We like, as we're going to other stops, to stop at farms around the state, knowing that no one part of the state is the same in another. And that's true in business. It's also true in farming. And recognizing the issues that we address are important to address from one part of the state to the other. Today I'm here not only honored to talk about that endorsement and to have the support folks standing with me here today, but also to announce our something we've talked about with the members of the Farm Bureau for some time, but to announce publicly our agenda agenda for agriculture here in the state of Wisconsin. You really look at the big three over the past 162 years in this state's history. It's been agriculture, manufacturing, and tourism that have built the state's economy. I am convinced it's those three industries that are going to help us get out of this recession and move forward. But we can't just continue down the same path. We need to continue to do things that strengthen those core industries, and that's what I'm talking about here today. But it's also not only nearly a $60 billion industry when it comes to agriculture in this state, employing over 420,000 people. It's also a way of life. And I know when we've got the vast majority of our farms are family farms, we know it's a way of life not only for these farms and for the farming families a part of it, but it's also a way of life for many of the communities that support our farms throughout Wisconsin. And so we're mindful of that as well. We laid out a strategy here that will help not only farms exist today, but help the next generation of farmers moving further into the 21st century. It's things that were alluded to, like helping control the tax burden, certainly helping with property tax relief, but in particular ensuring that we continue to strengthen the use value assessment in this state. It's something that even when I represented Wauwatosa, a suburban area in the legislature, I was proud to have supported. In fact, even got pretty good for a guy at the time didn't have any farms in his district, got a Friend of Agriculture award because of my support for that, and I was very proud, still have that on display today, because I knew the value of making sure that we didn't see family farms squeezed out of the ability to farm here in the state of Wisconsin. As governor, you're going to continue to have a champion for farmland use value assessment and make sure that continues to be strengthened to protect farms all across the state. In addition, I want to make sure that we hold government accountable to our farmers, and that means a series of things. Probably foremost is the fact that the regulations that we have in government, I believe, should be science-based and predictable. Science-based and predictable. Those are things where we should be using science and not whatever somebody in the bureaucracy wakes up thinking, and it should be accountable. And to that extent, I've heard time and time again the frustration. I know as earlier this year was talking to a dairy farmer from Jefferson who was frustrated, saying, in dealings with the DNR as an example, how he'd had several years of a good relationship, had one change in who he worked with. The law didn't change, the administrative rule didn't change, it just changed who he was working with, and suddenly things changed overnight. To me, it should be predictable and consistent all across the state, and it should be science-based. To that regard, one of the things in particular, when you talk about taking out permits, I believe that there needs to be certainty and it needs to be predictable. So part of our plan we're announcing is holding the government accountable, and in particular from the time that a farmer submits a permit to any state agency, will be requiring that under our administration that they certify that permit within 60 days, and with 180 days or less of that permit, they either have to act to approve or deny, or it's automatically assumed that it's been approved. Farmers need to have certainty. They have a business to run. They have a farm to run. They need to have certainty of knowing that they're not going to have a permit process that goes on forever. And I think that's something we've heard time and time again from farmers across the state. As governor, we're going to demand that kind of accountability. In addition, we're going to make sure that, as was mentioned, it's part of balancing the budget. We're not going to do what's happened in many ways in the past with other funds. We're not going to rate funds that were set aside for segregated purposes. When it comes to farming, things like the Ag Chem Management Fund or the Ag Chem Cleanup Program, those are things that are segregated funds and should stay for that purpose. And when I mentioned the DNR, one of the things, not only demanding accountability when it comes to permits, but just in general, I mentioned this last week when I talked about hunting and the frustrations I have as a hunter with some parts of the DNR, and making sure that the people who are involved are active in hunting, fishing, and trapping in the state. In the same regard, I'm going to make sure at a minimum at least one, if not more, of our appointees to the Natural Resources Board are people with an agriculture farming background. We think it's important to have people on the Natural Resources Board who understand the challenges our farmers face, and at a minimum at least one, if not multiple members, will specifically have a background in farming and agriculture across the state. In addition to holding the line on taxes and making our government more accountable, we want to make sure that we make it possible and more possible for the next generation of farms, our families to pass that on, so the next generation of farmers to be able to get by. And one of the ways in which we're doing that is not only at the state level, but lobbying the federal government when it comes to the death tax. That certainly is a challenge, making sure that it's affordable for one generation to pass the farm on to the next and not have to put that next generation out of business. Certainly it's making sure that we continue to provide incentives for modernization of equipment, knowing that part of that passing it on from one generation to the next is continuing to add updated equipment to make it easier to farm. And along the way, I mentioned not raiding funds, but as we look as farming becomes increasingly reliant on our transportation system, on getting crops and getting milk and other products from one part of the region or one part of the state to the other, we need to have a good transportation system, and that means fixing our roads and our bridges. As governor, I will not raid the transportation fund. I'll keep that money there so we can not only fix our roads and our bridges, but so that our local town boards and county boards and villages have enough money to fix the roads and bridges and streets in their given communities. And as governor, I'm going to continue to do that so we can get our product to and from market. And finally, when it comes to not only making sure taxes are low, the government's accountable, that we have the ability to pass on the farm from one generation to the next, but I'm going to make sure that we spend our time in the farm and not in the courtroom. And to that regard, we're going to continue to support and strengthen right to farm legislation in this state and make sure we do everything in our power to help fight frivolous and out-of-control lawsuits. Again, our farmers need to spend their time in the field and with the livestock and others, and not worrying about all the frivolous lawsuits. I support right to farm, and I want to make sure that we continue to strengthen that here in the state of Wisconsin. So that's part of our plan. We've got packets out for that today. We put it up on our website. We're letting the word go out. It's something, again, we've talked with farmers about all across the state, and I appreciate the support and help of all the folks who've been connected to us through the Wisconsin Farm Bureau, and I'm glad to accept the endorsement of the Volunteers for Agriculture, their volunteer component that comes out of the Wisconsin Farm Bureau. With that, I'll take any questions on that or other subject. Sure.
Yes, when you talk about using science-based approaches to regulations, can you give an example of what would be a science-based approach to any existing regulation?
Sure. Well, in terms of regulations overall, to me, I want a standard that comes in that say, if you're going to come up with a regulation, explain the science, the components to that. We've had it not only in farming. I was just talking to some home builders the other day who brought up a wind bracing issue in a state that doesn't have hurricanes, and they said, well, why is that? Well, they couldn't justify why that was there. And in any of those cases, whether it's home building, small business, agriculture, to me, there should be a science behind it, a justification behind it, not just because somebody in the bureaucracy said it was important.
Particularly complex proposal for a farm, it's 180 days at a hard time.
I think from that component, it's one of those where we want to have a resolution. If it's one of those where the farm and the bureaucracy or the state worker involved in the process has reached a mutual agreement. But what we're essentially trying to do is not have an endless and indefinite time frame in terms of permits. The response, the concern we heard from farmers as well as from other small business owners across the state is that so many state agencies leave them hanging. They don't have a response. They don't know yes or no. They'd like to know approve or deny, let us know. In the case of something where it made some sense and where there was a mutual agreement, that's something I think we could work out. But there's got to be some certainty, some predictability in terms of how long the permitting process is going to take.
I have a question about the campaign, but I don't know if you want to do that.
You can mix them in or no. I'm easy.
Okay. There was a new ad, I think it started today or maybe yesterday, about Mark Newman's vote on the transportation bill. I mean, this goes back to May of '98. It was not controversial at the time. It's 297 to 86. And basically, what he says is just a $215 billion 6-year spending bill. I mean, is this really the sort of thing? And then you compare it to Nancy Pelosi. Is this really the worst thing that Mark Newman's ever done? I mean, it seems kind of like a stretch going back 12 years comparing to Nancy Pelosi when the Republicans were controlling the House at the time.
Yeah. Two specific votes we've highlighted in that ad and another radio ad, and I think it is important because when Mark Newman first came to Congress in '94, he took on the status quo, he took on the establishment. He's running ads, even a response ad to this ad now that talks about him getting kicked off the Appropriations Committee. He took on the establishment. By the end of his tenure in the United States House of Representatives, he went from taking on the establishment to being a part of it. And he's running ads up until now that say he's a conservative. He's highlighted that. He's run on the campaign talking about his tenure in Congress back in the 1990s. And we think it's appropriate for people to see the full picture, not just what he did when he first took office, but where he was at the end. On the two votes we cite, the one in 1998 for one of the largest transportation bills ever, a bill that included $9 billion worth of pork barrel spending, a bill that included the original authorization for this funding for the bridge to nowhere in Alaska. Those are things that at the time were controversial. Jim Sensenbrenner, my congressman, Mark Newman's congressman today in the area where he lives, called it pork barreling at its worst. The Wall Street Journal called it a pork fest. Conservative commentators all across the country expressed extreme disdain with Republicans in the House of Representatives saying this goes contrary to everything they ran on in 1994 in the contract with America. So it actually was at that time very controversial, even though it had a significant number of votes. Now, because it was filled with pork, it wasn't just Republicans like Mark Newman at the time who voted for it, who got money for Janesville in it specifically for his district, but Nancy Pelosi got money for her district in San Francisco, so there were other Democrats who did vote for that. We think it's appropriate when people are saying, look at the candidates. What's the difference between Mark Newman and Scott Walker in the primary? Both of us talk about controlling spending. Both of us talk about cutting taxes. On probably one of the biggest issues that fiscal conservatives were focused in on in the 1990s, Mark Newman voted for the big spending. People like Jim Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin not only voted against it, but called it out for what it was. The other vote we highlighted that same year, again at the end of his time in Congress, was a vote for an $80 billion tax cut. Every member of Congress on the Republican side of the aisle from Wisconsin voted yes for the tax cut. Every Democrat from Wisconsin voted no. Mark Newman voted with all the Democrats from Wisconsin as well as Nancy Pelosi from California at the time. Rush Limbaugh went after Mark Newman for that. Jack Kemp went after him. The Wall Street Journal as well editorialized against that. I think on those two issues, if people want to know, they say, oh, Scott Walker, Mark Newman are both alike on almost every issue. On the issues we talk about, we are. But when it comes to spending and taxes, there's a very clear difference on two key votes. It's not just any vote. This was a vote that wasn't hidden in a budget. It wasn't hidden in anything else. And at the time, places like the Wall Street Journal and conservative commentators across the country highlighted both of those votes and said those were litmus tests.
He says this ad shows that you're worried about the latest poll numbers and that he's afraid that you're afraid that he's going to win this at the end.
I have said from day one, a member of Congress who's run for office 6 times, who's literally spent millions of his dollars, millions and millions of his own money as a formidable opponent. He's a good politician. He's run for office 6 times before. He served the United States Congress. We have always taken him seriously. The biggest reason why we're running this ad is voters asked me, they just asked me yesterday, what's the difference? And we've said, besides the fact that I've done it, I'm the only candidate in this race who's done what you want the next governor to do in terms of having inherited a mess that's almost identical to what the next governor is going to face and tackle it. Cut our debt, reduce the size of the government workforce, held the line in taxes, had a surplus. We've done it. That's the one big difference. The other big difference is on this particular series of votes.
If that transportation bill is a litmus test, you said Tom Barrett voted against it, so does that make him the equivalent of you as far as concern over pork barrel spending?
In that particular case, you look at that, he voted against it probably because there wasn't enough pork for his district. You'd have to ask him why he did it on that case. So I don't think that gives him any honor out there. I mean, on the same series of votes I cited, he voted against the tax increase. So Barrett and Newman were on the same side on that particular vote.
On the transportation bill, there's no vote that was the right vote.
What's that?
Well, the transportation bill, you criticized.
Sure, it's the right vote, but not for, but I say that for different reasons. I mean, my point is not to judge any other person other than to point out that Congressman Newman not just talks about being a conservative, he's talked specifically in this campaign and the ads that he's run about looking at what he did in the 1990s as a member of Congress. We say it is fair, if you're going to look at what happened in the beginning of his time in Congress when he took on the establishment, to look at what happened at the end of his time in Congress when he started to act more like the rest of the status quo there. I think that's a fair comparison, and these two votes seem to be a part of it. Again, if everybody else, I don't know that most voters would say just because a lot of other people voted for it is necessarily a good reason to justify a vote. And I think Jim Sensenbrenner's, who's been one of the most outspoken fiscal conservatives, not only from Wisconsin but in the United States Congress, his comments calling it log rolling or a pork barrel politicking at its worst, I think really reflect the sentiment that conservatives have when they look at that vote.
Scott, most of your ads up to now have gone after Tom Barrett's record. Why look before the primary be a switch?
Simple answer is, in the last 2 weeks, the question we hear the most is, what's the difference? I think it's fair. If people want to know what's the difference, we're telling them. We've told them right now, up until now, about our record. The other thing is they say, are there differences on the issues? And this is compare it to the attacks that Mark Newman, where he's been involved name-calling, other things. This is not about this. This is purely about votes. We're laying out the record of someone who's been in Congress, who's run for office 6 times, and who's put millions of dollars in trying to keep people from talking about his record or selectively talk about his record. We think it's perfectly fair and legitimate for voters to know the difference. These are things that are congressional record right out there. They're extremely legitimate for people to look at.
But wouldn't you have wanted to know the difference months ago when it was since this election next week?
People weren't asking about it until recently. I mean, seriously, I mean, in the last few weeks, people, as we've gotten closer to the primary, this is purely a response to voters asking, what's the difference in this race? Before then, much of the questions we got, that you guys asked as well, which I think is a reflection of the media, was the difference between me and the mayor of Milwaukee and other issues, or even some other factors out there with the president. But in the last couple of weeks, I think as people have paid more attention, the more stories have been out there about the primary, voters want to know the difference. And again, the big differences are, we've been running ads for some time about our record and how I'm the only one who's done it as a chief executive, who's reformed government, who moved this, my county forward and can do the same thing for the state. And I think it's completely legitimate when we look at some votes out there to say what the difference is as well.
We can do one more, guys. Pretty common in state budgets to legislate tucking some earmarks for the transportation projects or other building projects. When you get your first budget back from the legislature, will you detail any of those things?
Yes.
Yeah.
If they're earmarks, if they're specific to districts, you know, I'm opposed, as you're finding this budget, I know how to use a line item veto. I'm the only candidate in the race who's aggressively used a line item veto. And I plan on using it as governor no matter which party's in charge in the Assembly and the Senate. If there's spending that exceeds our ability to pay, I'm going to use it overall. And when it comes to district-specific pork barrel-related projects, there's no doubt I'll use a line item veto to veto things.
You guys all know how to get a hold of Jill. If you don't, please come find me.
Thanks, everybody.
Give her contact info. Thanks, Tom.